All right, beautiful people, welcome to another episode of the Silicon Valley to Spirituality Show. This week I am interviewing the CEO of Persimmon.life, Mark Hadfield. We talk about parenting, we talk about business, we talk about the law of attraction. This is a very interesting episode. I hope you guys enjoy it. So without further ado, let's jump right in. All right, welcome everybody to the Seibo No Show, where we talk about everything from business in Silicon Valley all the way to spirituality. And today I have a very special guest. He is a very good friend of mine. His name is Mark Hadfield, the CEO of Persimmon.life. I was about to say permission.life, but we all have permission to be human beings. It is Persimmon.life. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Seibo. Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
All right, all right. Well, before we jump in, because I had butchered the name, Persimmon.life, why don't we do a quick intro of who you are, what Persimmon.life is, and then we'll jump into our usual conversation. Can you give our listeners a brief overview of who you are and what Persimmon is?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Mark Hadfield. I'm originally from South Africa. I'm a serial entrepreneur living in Marin, California, and I've started a number of different companies. The most recent one, as you said, is Persimmon.life, which is currently a 2-year-old company. And what we do is we send nurses to people's homes to give medical aesthetic treatments like Botox. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, the Uber of Botox. You know, you order up a nurse, she comes over to your house, gives you a medical aesthetic treatment in your home. It's a much better experience than going to a med spa, waiting in line. It's a concierge service. And so we launched the business 2 years ago. We took funding from Tim Draper, who's an amazing investor. Highly recommend the guy. And we are building an army of nurses across the country. Probably end up 15,000, something in that range. And it's going great. It's just been really well received. It's growing very quickly. And so we're just super excited about the future and growing this company.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And you used the analogy, you called it the Uber of something. Can you say that one more time?
Uber of Botox. It's kind of a bad analogy because with Uber, you don't really care who your driver is. You just order up the ride and the ride arrives and you probably never use that person again. Whereas with ours, you order up your nurse, she sits and talks to you for, I say she, 98% of our providers are female. We do have some male providers. Anyway, that person spends 45 minutes talking to you and treating to you. It's kind of like getting your haircut. So you get to know them, you establish some friendship and rapport, and then next time you'll have the same person come to your treatment. So the Uber thing is not a great analogy, but the home service and the concierge service and the use of the app to connect is a good analogy.
That's so awesome. What immediately came to mind was I was thinking about how much I miss going to a barber. I cut my own hair now, obviously, but I did for a time still go to a barber to give me this haircut because I just enjoyed spending, 40 minutes, an hour with my barber, just shooting the shit. And what's really interesting is, we do live in a time now where we have to be really watchful of our pronouns. And yes, the majority of the nurses are women, and I noticed that you corrected yourself. And in my own head, I made that little correction too, which is so weird because I know you as a person, I know what you meant to say, but we always finding ourselves having to just correct ourselves and make sure that we're not offending anybody. And I find that to be quite interesting in living in a day and time when we're trying to be so open and so inclusive of people's thoughts, yet we seem to chastise those that may mispronounce a pronoun or leave out a pronoun and things of that nature. But that's neither here nor there. That's just something that I've been thinking a lot about. The reason why I wanted to have you on today's show is that we have both been in the cannabis industry. We all know how challenging that is. We are both entrepreneurs. We are also both parents. And so what I wanted to dive into today was kind of how you balance your parental life with your professional life. And maybe a good place that we could start is, when you were in the cannabis space, this is something that's been coming up quite a bit with a lot of the people that in the new neighborhood that I live in now. It's a much more conservative town. And so when I lived in the Bay Area, talking about being in the cannabis industry, having children, it all seemed like really, really normal. Now that I've moved out to Sacramento, where it's quite a bit more conservative, and I freely talk about being a parent with cannabis or utilizing cannabis, I get a lot of raised eyebrows. I get a lot of like hushing. Even when the other parents, both of them consume cannabis and we're talking about it, they're very, very secretive around their children. And I started realizing, wow, I must have, been living in a bubble where all of this was quite normalized. So I'm curious, what has your experience been as a parent that used to be in the cannabis industry? And I'm just kind of curious how you used to reconcile that with your family as well as the neighborhood and that you were in.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, we live in Marin, and so cannabis is everywhere, widely accepted and very socially acceptable amongst parents. But you're right, it's a bit of a dilemma with kids, and I think it is a dilemma as a parent because you don't, even though you can be totally comfortable with cannabis as a medication. I personally use it every night still. I use it to sleep. I find that if I don't take it, I don't sleep. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I tend to take an edible around dinner time. It relaxes me. It makes me more cheerful. It actually makes me a better parent, I think, because the stress goes away. I have better interactions with my kids, as opposed to being irritated with them because of the stress of my day and that bringing that out on them. Instead, I'm more present with cannabis, more pleasant to be around. I joke with them. I listen to music. So I think that they appreciate that. The dilemma, of course, is I don't want my kids taking cannabis. I don't want them taking any drug, and so it does normalize it if you're completely open with your kids about your use of cannabis, and so that is a bit of a dilemma. There's no way around that, really. I guess you could use the same analogy with alcohol, though, right? You could say, well, it's okay for me to have a glass of wine, but I'm not going to give my 12-year-old a glass of wine, and she just needs to understand that wine is for adults. So I guess you could use the same analogy. But on the other hand, she sees all of her friends taking cannabis. And if she sees her dad taking cannabis every night, that definitely does normalize it. So it's an ongoing dilemma. I mean, I don't tell my kids that I take cannabis every night. I just take it discreetly. But I'm sure they know because they see the change in my mood and they're not stupid. So it's not something I worry too much about. I think when they were much younger, it was probably more of a dilemma, where I really didn't want them to know. Now that they're teenagers, I don't think it's so much of an issue.
Yeah, that is very interesting. My eldest is now a teenager, and they were teaching her about responsibility or drug use and what to stay away from and what's okay. And it was really interesting when she came home and she educated me on what she learned. And what was quite interesting was, I realized she must have really been paying attention to a lot of she has watched me do interviews, so she regurgitated a lot of the things that I would say. And then I asked her, what does this mean to you? And she was like, I don't know. I've just heard you say it. So it was kind of interesting to kind of see like what they truly understood versus what they were just mimicking. And, it's interesting because I like to fancy myself as a really cool, chill person, husband, father. And when I don't consume cannabis, my wife, she'll always ask me, she'll say, hey, when was the last time you consumed cannabis? And I'll proudly say, hey, it's been a while. It's been a full day. And she's like, well, it might be time to take a couple puffs. And then I'll ask why. And she's like, because you're annoying me right now. And now I've come to realize that my wife does prefer the enhanced version of myself that's a little bit more chill, a little bit more mellow. And I guess I had been consuming so much cannabis, I had just thought that was my baseline personality, only to realize my baseline personality is more type A-ish and quite, at least in her opinion, maybe a little bit annoying when it comes to any thoughts that I feel maybe self-righteous about and how strongly I feel like I am right in a specific situation, but under I don't want to say influence because it almost sounds like a different type of drug, but when I am powered by cannabis, I seem to be, I don't want to say less bought into my thoughts, but I think I'm more willing to hear other people's thoughts and not just hear them, but actually try to empathize and see things through their viewpoint. So why don't we transition? now you're no longer in cannabis. You started another startup, which I think is quite amazing. After my first startup, I needed to take literally a 2.5 year break before I started reintegrating with society. So, can you tell me a little bit about the transition from cannabis into, I don't even want to call it the Uber of Botox. I want to call it like the barbershop of
Medical
Botox.
aesthetics. Yeah. Medical
Clinical
aesthetics.
aesthetics. Yeah, yeah.
Medical
Can you tell me
aesthetics. Yeah.
medical
Yeah, what was
aesthetics?
interesting, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, the way I got started in this business was I was actually pitching an investor, my business partner, Matthew Bartlett. He was a cannabis investor. He worked for one of the biggest funds in cannabis, and so I was pitching him for capital, and he listened to the pitch and he said it sounded interesting, but he had done this research on medical aesthetics and Botox and at-home Botox, and he had realized that there was very little competition. And so he presented me the research and said, "Well, what do you think about this?" I looked at it and I was just like, "Wow, cannabis is hard. You know this, Seibo. It's hard to make money in an industry where the laws are changing all the time. You're partially legal, partially illegal. You could lose your bank account at any minute. You could lose your merchant account even faster. And there's many businesses that you can't do business in. You can't sell across state lines. It's just a very difficult industry. And then you couple with that the legalization of it and the recreational side of it, and sort of how it was wiping out many small businesses on the medical side. Excuse me, difficult business to make money in. And so when I looked at what my business partner presented to me, the medical aesthetics, I just realized, hey, this business can scale. It's got great unit economics. It doesn't have this illegal or quasi-legal status. And many of the lessons that I'd learned from the previous startup around telehealth, around marketing, around organic search marketing, because you can't buy ads, all of this was very applicable to doing medical aesthetics with just much more upside and legality. So I decided to leave the business. It's called LMD. It's in the hands of my previous business partner, Larry Lisser. He's the new CEO, and just to kick off this new one. And put together a PowerPoint pitch, went out for capital without too much confidence, because, how many businesses get funded off a PowerPoint pitch? It's kind of a long shot. But as I said, we met up with Tim Draper, and he's been fantastic. He wrote the check. He wrote the first check right off the business plan on a PowerPoint, which has never happened to me before as an entrepreneur. I've always had to bootstrap things to some degree before somebody would finally come in as an investor. But Tim listened to the pitch, said, "I love it." He didn't screw around and say, "Well, who else is investing?" And, ask those kind of annoying questions that many VCs spend forever asking you about. He just said, "I like it. I like the team. Let's do it." He wrote it. He wrote the check and he backed us. So, that was fantastic. And I have to say, it's been a great move for me. It's just because my thesis around this business having more upside and less restriction has proven to be true. And so, now both companies are still running, and the new one's growing very quickly. So I feel very good. I'm still a shareholder in the old one. Larry's doing a great job of running it, but the new one I think is showing real promise. So.
Yeah, I've been one of Larry's biggest cheerleaders. He updates LinkedIn quite a bit with what's going on that side. But, I'm curious. My experience with investors has been the same. They'll always seem excited when you show them the PowerPoint, or, it's better if you have a product to show them, but they'll always want to do their due diligence, and they'll have their, I don't want to call them cronies or underlings, but they'll have the more junior members start doing their due diligence and the proctology exam and wanting to know everything about what you're doing and what you're not doing. So when Tim just immediately kind of intuitively said, "I'm in," was that, I'm imagining that's quite a positive feeling, but at the same time, did you think like, wow, how come he didn't do more due diligence?
Well, how much diligence can you do off a PowerPoint, right? There's nothing to diligence really other than the background of the founders. So, I think that there's different types of investors. There's tire kicker investors who will not make a decision. They will only chase, other investors because they're trying to get in on the hot deal. And so those investors that ask you, who else is investing? Those are the ones that are not going to invest unless there's somebody else that they respect, who's already in, that they can chase. Then you have other investors, and maybe it's because they've achieved some type of escape velocity. I mean, Tim Draper is an example. I'm sure there's other tier one investors, maybe Sequoia, Benchmark, who will come up with their own uh, uh, investment thesis, and they'll pull the trigger. Obviously, it's harder to get their investment. They've got to be convinced. But I have huge respect for Tim Draper to not screw around, and it's not just the first time. He's actually put now 3 checks into the company, and every time it's the same. You meet with him, he gives you half an hour of his time, he listens to what you say, he makes a decision 2 days later and tells you what his decision is. He doesn't, spend forever doing anything, frankly. And so that is the best type of investor if you can get the confidence of a man like that. Besides the fact he's just a wonderful, generous man, if you've ever spent time with Tim Draper, but he has the Draper University. I think he's created something like 20 different unicorns in his portfolio. So he's a very generous, warm man, and I can't recommend him enough as an investor.
Wow. This is pretty interesting. I didn't think I would be focusing my time on this interview on Tim Draper, but one of the things that is really coming to me is that, as you mentioned, these other types of investors that are just kind of tire kickers and looking for one of their friends to, validate whether or not this is a sound investment or not. I realize, oh, I must be one of these like rookie investors, because that's exactly what I do. Is I get pitched and then it sounds good, and then I start calling around and looking for friends to give me some idea if this is like a good investment or not, versus trusting, how I felt about the opportunity. And I think this is like a really good example of people that want as much data as possible to make a perfect decision, and those that could trust their intuition. And I know you and I have had some of these conversations in the past, and I'm just curious, watching someone like Tim, maybe I'm projecting here, but the way it sounds like to me is he's really trusting his gut. Did that teach you anything about trusting your gut versus when to look at data?
I mean, I think the data thing is interesting because the other thing I notice is that investors often present a dilemma to you. They'll tell you that there's not enough proof points in the data, and then they'll tell you that your valuation is too high. Whereas, as an entrepreneur, you gather proof points as you go, and obviously the valuation goes up as you go. And so you seldom have both things at the same time. If you want to get in early at a low valuation, you have to accept that the investment's going to not have proved every single proof point and have data to prove it. On the other hand, if you want to wait until those proof points are in, you need to accept a higher valuation. It's a later stage investment, but it seems like a lot of investors want to have their cake and eat it too. They want both of those things. I'll make one more comment on investments. This is just my observation, is that often if you find that the investors you're talking to are tire kickers, you might be pitching for too little money, because I've noticed that there's a correlation between the investment round that you're asking for and how much tire kicking you get. So if you're looking for like $500,000 in seed capital, or $750 in seed capital, or $1.5 million in seed capital, you're going to get a lot of tire kickers. You're going to get guys that write $200,000 checks, and they'll spend meeting after meeting after meeting with you forever, wasting your time. And sometimes it's better just to say, look, I'm going to do a $5 million seed, or I'm going to do a $10 million Series A. And suddenly you find that people take you more seriously. They, waste less of your time because they realize that, you're actually going to get something done. And of course, there's the whole fit with them putting capital to work, and is it worth their time? But the point is that if people are writing small checks, they tend to spend more time kicking tires, in my opinion. That's just my experience.
Wow. This is really interesting to talk about, the psychology of investment. Having raised capital before, as you're saying that, it totally correlates to my experience, which was when we were asking for small amounts because we didn't want to be diluted. So many of the conversations were of the tire kicking type. And when we were like, hey, we just need this much money, we don't want to raise again, we need like a war chest, there was much more serious discussions, and it was still difficult, but at least, the people seem to be in or out much quicker versus these longer conversations that kind of string along until, someone waves the white flag or a small puny investment is actually made. And so, as you've grown as an entrepreneur yourself, like when do you feel like you could rely on your intuition, and when do you feel like you need more information to make a sound decision?
Um, I guess it depends on the decision. So I tend to I tend to trust my intuition very strongly. I try to listen. I know you do. You're way better at it than I am because that's how you orient your whole life is based on uh, understanding your intuition. So you're way better at it than I am. I put a lot of credence into my own intuition, and I tend to really spend time just thinking how I feel about something. And if I feel uneasy for whatever reason, there's 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 always a reason why you feel uneasy, right? So if you're going to make a decision, you shouldn't feel uneasy about it. If you do, it's probably best not to make a decision. I mean, that's my other thing is that if you don't know what to do, don't do anything. I never make changes in business unless I'm pretty sure that the change I'm making is the right change. If I'm unsure, I'll just wait. And then the other thing I'll say is that the answer is always in your P&L. If you're unsure about what to do about your business, the answer is in your P&L. So, you may be confused. You're trying to grow sales. Your sales aren't closing. Your sales cycles are too long. Do you not have product market fit? Your marketing mix is wrong. You don't understand who your customer base is. You're not attracting the right employees. There's so many different elements that make up what might be a successful growing business. And if you're unsure about which of those things is incorrect, look in your P&L. And the other thing about the P&L is it's important to do your own modeling. Model your own P&L, because once you do that and you start running the numbers, it becomes very clear to you where the problems are in your business model, right? That's just my own experience. I don't know if I'm explaining that clearly enough, but every time I've spent, say, a week or 2 weeks creating and manipulating and changing and dialing in a P&L, I always come out with a much clearer understanding of where my business is, what needs to happen, where the problems are, because you start to see the inflection points. If I just change this, if I shorten my sales cycle, if I increase my sales price, if I spend more money on marketing, you see how it impacts the P&L. And so it becomes pretty clear what you need to do. And so my advice is if you're overwhelmed and confused about how to grow your business, go back to your P&L and spend time. Don't give it to your finance guy to do it for you. Spend your own time with it in front of you, making changes, manipulating the model. And at the end of the day, my experience is you'll come up with a very clear idea of what's wrong with your business. And it might be catastrophic, right? Your conclusion might be that this business is screwed. That's okay, right? It's much better to have that answer than confusion and ongoing burning of capital. So,
Yeah, wow. Wow, I that hits home with me as well. I definitely outsourced a lot of that to our CFO. And the reason it became clear to me, you said it yourself, there was like a fear of like, hey, what if I see something that's like so obvious that this isn't going to work? And I ended up putting my head in the sand. And often I would just come up with scenarios in my head to comfort myself. And then I would get into discomfort and have to come up with some other scenario in my head. But the part that you said that really resonated with me, and I think you're giving me far too much credit for my own intuition myself, is, as I'm cultivating my ability to trust my own intuition, one of the things that I had to really delineate was like, hey, am I feeling something that is off about this decision? Or is this just coming from a place of fear? Like I don't want to upset my investors, or I'm scared that if I make this decision, it's going to fall back on me. So many times I had difficulty delineating or kind of separating like, hey, is this like really a bad decision? Or am I just, fearful and paranoid about something that's going to happen? So I'm kind of frozen in this fear. Do you have any kind of tips or suggestions of how you're able to clear up the difference between having a true understanding that this is a bad decision and it doesn't sit right with you and we should maybe take another 24 to 48 hours to think this through, versus I'm just in fear mode and I'm not able to access my higher mind because I'm in a fear-based mode?
I think that is a great question, and it's very valid. You don't want to make decisions from a place of fear. Fear is not a healthy emotion. Fear is not an emotion of abundance. It's not an emotion of action. It's an emotion of conservatism, crawling into a ball, you know, not believing that you can succeed. It goes against self-belief, you know. So fear is not a good thing at all. I guess a better description for what I said previously is that if your intuition is telling you it's a bad decision, it's cognitive dissonance that you're looking for, right? It's like, okay, I've rationalized this decision, so I'm going to make this investment, but I've got this cognitive dissonance, and the cognitive dissonance is your mind telling you that maybe you're taking the easy way out, right? Maybe you think you're going to make this investment in marketing because you think that's the answer, and logically it makes sense. But in reality, you're just unwilling to face the fact that your sales leader is not the right person, and you need to replace that person, right? You need to take the challenge head on and replace the sales guy or sales leader. But instead, you're going to rely on investing more money in marketing because you have the money available, and so you're avoiding the truth. So that's sort of the cognitive dissonance. That's not something that you're fearful about, but it's something that if you really take the time to think about how you really feel, you'll understand that you're unwilling to face up to the true decision. You already know what the real answer is. The real answer is this person you really like is the wrong leader and you need to get rid of them. So don't go and make the investment in marketing. So if, on the other hand, you're fearful, that's just a bad thing to have. As I said, I don't think anything good comes from fear. I really don't. We live in a world of abundance. We live in a world of possibility. And the best way to tap into that abundance, this, is to open yourself to it, right? To open yourself, to communicate, to ask people for help, to clearly state your intentions, to actively go about what you're going about, as opposed to what I described when you get that sense of fear. And I don't mean to say that I've nailed this. I still struggle with this myself at times. All of us have existential feelings of fear. What if this happens? What if that happens? But my own experience is that whenever I feel that way, it's not a good thing. For example, you can't walk into an investor meeting scared that you're going to fail and then expect that investor to write a check. They're not going to do it because your fear is contagious, right? They can tell, they can sense it. On the other hand, if you walk in and you really are full of confidence and enthusiasm because you believe in your mission, you believe you've got a great business, and you're really trying to make an impact, and you've got to work your ass off, and you can do it. That feeling is that enthusiasm comes across, and people pick up on it. And so that's the way to succeed. I don't have really an answer of how to get rid of the fear, but I guess trying to differentiate it between fear and cognitive dissonance is an important distinction.
Yeah, when you were talking about cognitive dissonance, like this really strong imagery was coming into my head was like, you'll have cognitive dissonance when your mind is telling you one thing and then your heart's telling you another. And maybe
Right.
your mind is telling you like, hey, we got to fire that VP of sales. And your heart's like, well, I know the VP of sales family and, I don't want to deliver bad news. And you're like, well, just fuck it. Let's spend more money on marketing and maybe it will fix the
Exactly.
problem when you deep down know what the issue is. So, man, that really resonated with me. And I know we do talk about some metaphysical concepts when we're not on a podcast together, but I don't know if you know, but what you just kind of stated really aligns with the people that teach like the law of attraction or manifestation, which is, when you go into something with fear, the way that they talk about it is that your fear, you were talking about how like investors could just kind of like smell the fear and like it'll somehow like affect them in a way. And in the law of attraction, what they're saying is, yeah, actually like the resonance and like your electromagnetic field is different when you're in a fearful state, and it causes people to have a certain feeling while around you, just like when someone who's very magnetic walks into the room or someone that's very optimistic. It's like all of a sudden he raises that aggregate energy of the room up to follow. So I'm curious, I don't think we've ever talked about manifestation or the law of attraction, so I was curious, did you come to this conclusion yourself, or was this, through many rounds of raising money, you just noticed like, hey, when I show up a certain way, I tend to get a check. If I show up another way, I tend to, scare away investors.
Yeah, these are my own internal observations, right? I mean, one thing I do think about is the soft tyranny of low expectations. you familiar with that term? The soft tyranny of low expectations. I
No.
think as I think back on my own. Well, let me just explain the metaphor. So it's a soft tyranny because it is a tyranny, but it's not a hard tyranny. It's a subtle tyranny. And so I think back on my own career development. When I was very young, I started my first company straight out of college. Really didn't know what I was doing. I thought I did. I was full of confidence and I had no knowledge whatsoever, right? Now, if I put myself back in my shoes at that time, I would never have started my first company because I would have known that I was naive and I was going to fail, likely to fail, and really had no business starting a business because I had no business experience. I should have gone and got business experience first, but because I was naive, I believed I could do it, and guess what? I did it. I did it with my brother, pulled it off, managed to succeed. In fact, it seemed easy. Um, but having struggled a little bit after in subsequent companies and been through a number of situations where things didn't come as easily, and in fact they were incredibly difficult to pull off. That started to lower back my expectations of what I believed was achievable, and that is the soft tyranny, right? Because we all know that we live in a world of abundance, right? You see it all around us. And in fact, we're living in a world of increasing abundance, not decreasing abundance. And it's not a zero sum game. It's not that there's so much around and you just got to grab your little piece. And if you take that little piece, that means someone else is losing up on their piece. That's not the way the world works. The way the world works is that when you create something, it attracts more people. And the more people get involved, they create more things. And then the pie gets bigger and bigger. And that's happening all the time. If you just look at the productivity of the GDP of the country, of the world, how it's increasing and increasing exponentially all the time. And so we are going through a transition that's unprecedented in history. Ideas spread faster than ever before. There's endless amounts of investment capital out there. Technology is enabling things to be done so much cheaper and productivity is to be so much more increasing. So this is not a world of scarcity at all, and we shouldn't have this tyranny of low expectations. We should have self belief and realize that we are in a unique point in history, and we're gonna do it. We're gonna pull it off. We want to do it because we don't want to be working in a dead end job that we don't like. Not earning as much money as we want to or need to. Struggling, unhappy, fearful. No, we want to live in a world of abundance, empowerment. We want to be part of the revolution that's happening all the time, whether it's technological or productivity. We want to be surrounded by the smartest people. So these are things that we want. So why would we have low expectations or decreasing expectations because we're getting older and we've suffered failure? That's why it's a tyranny. It's tyrannical. So anyway, I think about this a lot because I know it's a human thing, and it's happened to me, and I've seen other people that I love and care about go through the same process. They start off thinking, "Hey, I want to change the world," and then they end up thinking, "I just want to pay off my mortgage." That's their goal. Or even, "I just want to buy a house and have a mortgage." You know what I mean? So that's how expectations could be diminished, and you know that's okay. I'm not criticizing people for having low goals. Not everybody wants to change the world. If your goal is to buy a house and that's it, that's great. But I think what's a bad thing is if your expectations are dampened because you've suffered failure or you're experiencing fear, and so your expectations are dampened, because that is where this tyranny comes from.
Yeah, yeah, I love that distinction of like, hey, if you just want to, just buy a house and have a mortgage and that's your definition of success, that's fine. But if you really want to save the world, but you've experienced some setbacks and then you readjusted what you wanted to do, then that is kind of a bummer to hear. And what really stood out to me about your story and what I love about it is that I had a similar experience, which was the first business that I started. Everything was like so easy and success was easy to get. And it really gave me enough confidence to go, okay, I could do this. And then my subsequent projects, just filled with so many mistakes and so many learning lessons. And I really believe like I truly learned how to be an entrepreneur by my unsuccessful projects. And to me, it's almost like this beautiful thing, which was I was too dumb to know what I didn't know. To your point, had I known how difficult it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have gotten started. So how beautiful it was that, out the gates, I had kind of like beginner's luck, to fuel me with enough confidence. So over the next few years of getting beat down, would still show up and learn all the lessons I needed to learn to truly be a decent entrepreneur. And so, what's really coming to me when you talked about the world being so abundant is, well, me, I moved out of the Bay Area to a, kind of rural area and really got deeply immersed in spiritual teachings. And that is like a very common spiritual teaching is like, we're not in this zero-sum game world. Everything is abundant. And, if you sit in these conversations long enough, you just hear this so often that it almost becomes like, it loses its power because that's what everyone says. And, I know we've had these conversations, but I don't think I've ever asked you, what are your spiritual beliefs? I'm curious now because a lot of what you said, it does very much align with a lot of these spiritual teachings that I've immersed myself over the past few years. But I've always believed like we've had very like rational, logical conversations with a little bit of like, openness to intuition and emotional intelligence. But I'm kind of curious where you stand spiritually.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I was actually having this conversation with my daughter, my 15-year-old daughter, last night, in fact, and she's learning different schools of religion, and so we were talking about them. I'm an atheist. Um, um, However, I don't. When I look at all of the different world religions, the one that I find most interesting and intuitive and closest to my own set of beliefs is Buddhism. And I'm not a Buddhist because there's aspects of Buddhism that I don't agree with, but there's aspects of Buddhism that I really like and appreciate. Uh, One of them is that, the Buddhists, from my interpretation, you might disagree with this, or other Buddhists might tell me that I'm misunderstanding Buddhism, but my understanding is that Buddhism is about self-enlightenment, right? It's your own spiritual growth, and therefore God lives within you, and you can become God, or you can become God-like by becoming enlightened. And so I think that's a very empowering philosophy because, where is God if God is not within us, right? Where is God if God is not in my little dog who I love dearly and is just the light of my life, or in my child, or in the relationship I have with my child, or just in experiencing nature? God has to be everywhere, depending on how you define it. And so the Buddhist philosophy of, you know, God is within us, God is within you, and you can become God-like by evolving yourself spiritually, and you can achieve a state of enlightenment in your lifetime. You can do it this lifetime. To me, that's an incredibly empowering philosophy. And if you just take the word God out of it, or Buddhism out of it, you just think about contemplating your place in the world and the universe and how you interact with people and where you want to go and whether you're a kind person or a moral or an ethical person. All of those things fit very nicely into the Buddhist framework and in general principles for living well, I'd say. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I'd say that Buddhism is the religion that I'm closest to. When I look at all of the other religions, they just look like dogma to me. And the interesting thing is they're the same. They're two sides of the same coin. If you take Islam, for example, and the prophets and the places, that's not too different to the Jewish Torah. I mean, some of the holy places are actually the same places. And and in Christianity, you've got Jesus, who is the prophet and the messenger and the Son of God. And then in Islam, you've got Muhammad. So these things are not very different, but they just sound like dogma to me for the most part. And so, to sum it up, I'd say I'm an atheist. Why am I an atheist? Because I've never seen evidence that's scientific of God. And if there was evidence that was scientific of God, all the scientists would be very interested in studying it scientifically. So, I would take a science-based approach to the world. But I also think that our view on the world and on the universe and on life is so limited and so incorrect. And I think we would all agree that it's minuscule and the truth is so much bigger than we understand. And so it's not that I dismiss spirituality, because I think that there are ways, like the way you use meditation to tap into your intuition. There are ways to connect with the world in a way that you don't fully understand and nobody fully understands. So I just wouldn't call that religion necessarily for me. I'm open-minded to those things. I just wouldn't call it religion.
Yeah, I love that answer. I love that answer because, there's this openness, but at the same time, you're like, hey, like I haven't had these, quote unquote mystical experiences that these people are talking about. And to be honest, when I speak to a lot of these people that have had these so-called mystical experiences, sometimes I scratch my head like, did you really? Because it seems like, your behavior is of someone that hasn't had one. And what I find extremely, like really interesting is that I believe what you believe, which is you don't have to have this belief in a God or a greater being in order to reach a point to realize like you could reach enlightenment in this lifetime. And I think that, at least for me, I've had these experiences, but I also know that your brain chemistry can do some pretty funky things. And there are times when you might perceive that you're having a mystical experience, but you're having 400 billion chemical reactions in your body every single second. And if one of these reactions misfires in a way, you may think like you're seeing some, being that is outside of you when it is all happening within your head. But it's almost it almost doesn't matter if there is or isn't, is that I'm trying to find a place where I can feel present in this life, where I could enjoy this life, where I could maximize my time as well as the people that I love who are around me maximize their time through my actions. And that sounds a lot like what you were describing. Is that similar to what you were stating?
Yeah, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about this when I was a bit younger. I'd recommend to anybody who's interested in their own spiritual path or their own definition and understanding of their spirituality, as you just said, to read the book The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, who's a British scientist. And oftentimes you'll ask somebody about religion and they'll say something like, "Well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not necessarily religious," or they'll say, "I'm an agnostic." Uh, or I believe in something, but I'm not 100% sure what it is. They'll give you some type of answer like that. If you read The God Delusion, he goes through in excruciating detail the logic of religion and religious thinking and breaks it down in a way that most people haven't given it consideration. And at the end of the day, the book challenges you to dismiss the dogmatic beliefs that you may feel you know somewhat attached to, but you haven't really given it critical thought. So the book helps you give religion critical thinking. So I'd recommend that book. I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer your question? I don't think I did.
Yeah,
What
well,
was
you
the
answered
question?
it, and then I was just asking if I was kind of summarizing your kind of view on how to, I guess, reconcile atheism while still being open to this like infinite, abundant world. Um,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
you did
yeah,
answer
I think
that.
that yeah, I think the connection between those two things is that we just don't know. So you can be an atheist and say I don't know. Being an atheist doesn't is not an acknowledgement that God doesn't exist. It's an acknowledgement that there is no evidence that I've seen of God. Of course, God could exist. God could show up and hover over the bay in a blinding light and start speaking to everybody, and the scientists would be all over it, right?
Yeah,
But do I
yeah.
do I believe it's going to happen? Not necessarily, but it could, right?
Well, I remember when we first met for barbecue in San Mateo, we had a conversation about simulation theory and how interesting that concept of simulation theory is. And as I studied quantum physics more, and they were talking about the nature of physical reality or 3D space time, you were talking about how so much of like the light spectrum or the sound spectrum is hidden from us because our eyes and ears could only pick up on certain light waves and audio frequencies. Like I had stumbled upon a really interesting article about if you collapse the empty space between the nucleus and an electron, and then you took the total mass of all 8 billion humans and collapsed the empty space of all the atoms that make up all the humans, is that all 8 billion of us would be able to fit inside a sugar cube. And the interesting thing about that was they were utilizing an analogy in the article. And this will probably be the last thing that we talk about before I send you off on the day, but I think this is a nice little topic to end on, was that he talked about, like, when you drag a Word document into the trash, that Word document is made up of a bunch of pixels. The trash can is also a bunch of pixels, but it allows you and I to interface with this 2D desktop in order to, throw away that file. But behind the file, those pixels are just hiding, all the code that is behind what that Word document or the recycling can looks like. And then behind the code, behind the screen, is actually just a bunch of transistors, diodes, and capacitors. So the author was making a comparison that, these, like, what would be pixels or sprites on a screen on the two-dimensional level, that's what atoms and molecules are on the three-dimensional level, which is all of your molecules give me a representation of Mark Hadfield, and then you see a representation of me. But hidden behind all of that is something far more complex. But because we are trying to enjoy our existence in this 3D plane, a lot of that external reality is hidden from us. So space-time is like a data compression tool so that our consciousness can have a physical experience. Just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I spent a lot of time thinking about is death. And, I had the experience of watching my father die firsthand. I was sitting by his side, and I saw him go through a transition, of life to death, and go through the physical struggle of death. And of course, once he died, he was gone. And I missed him and miss him terribly. I also had traumatic experiences with pets. I lost my beloved young dog, who's 3 years old. He was tragically run over. Um,
Oh, man.
And so I think a lot about death. And my other observation about people is that people don't think about death. This is again one of the Buddhist things. The Buddhists believe, study death, they think about death, they meditate on death, they prepare for their death because they believe that that's the opportunity for their spiritual evolution, and they're trying to evolve spiritually in this life so that they can reincarnate, as a higher being coming back. So I do like that part of Buddhism again. But people generally don't. It's amazing that death is the one thing that everyone suffers, right? As Jim Morrison said, no one gets out alive. And yet people all seem to act as if they're going to get out alive, right? They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to face it. And that's really quite a funny way of approaching something that's inevitable. It's coming our way. It's incredibly profound. It's going to affect us all, and we're going to have to go through it individually. So I do spend time thinking about that. And when you talk about atoms and molecules, and is this reality? You know, somebody dying and then not having a connection with that person when you love them, or maybe you do still have a connection with them. That is something that is incredibly profound. It really is. Just trying to contemplate: does the connection persist? Does it not persist? Can I tap into it? I actually wear my father's wedding ring on my finger, and often if I'm stressed or full of self-doubt, I'll twirl the ring and think about my father and think about the lessons that he taught me and think about his strength of character. And so, I wonder if he is still present in my life. If he is, to what extent is he present? Is he present only in my DNA, or is he present in some other way? I do feel as if I can tap into his strength of character just by thinking about him. So I don't know. I'm just giving you some ideas of what my mind works on. When you get into things like metaphysics, and are we living in a simulation, and what is the universe really comprised of, and is it a hologram? These things are beyond my scientific capabilities to really understand, even though I find them fascinating. But I don't have the scientific training to really break those things down into usable information for myself. I'm just interested in it. So again, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. And I'm similar to you, which is I have been an atheist for the large majority of my life until I started having these experiences without entheogens or psychedelics, but there's still a rational, logical part of me that's like, well, there's a lot of brain chemistry going on. So even though in my opinion, it has been like the scientific process of like, this is repeatable and I get a similar conclusion every single time, there's still a part of me that's very open to like, wow, all of this is kind of happening in my head, and how do I know if that's real or not? But I have found, a lot of comfort, like when I lost my father, it was very close to the time I had this awakening. So my logical, rational mind was like, oh, I'm missing my father. Of course, I'm searching for answers. But as I searched for answers, the evidence started becoming, more and more compelling to me. And it's really interesting, as I studied quantum physics more, and to your, what you said, like I have a certain capacity of absorbing all this information. So I can't say I understand it 100%, but as I studied more, it started, at least in my framework, started explaining a lot of these metaphysical ideas, utilizing language that was much more digestible by me. So this has been just a really awesome conversation. I wish we had another, hour to keep going, but we have you have a day job that you have to get to. Tim Draper's probably watching. What's this guy, Mark, doing with my money? I'm just kidding. But before I let you go, how could people find more about Persimmon? How could people find out a little bit more about you in case they loved what you were talking about? How can they find you?
Oh, well, they can find me. I'm on Twitter actually. Recently, I've tried to get on Twitter many times and never had the interest to keep going with it. I always found it kind of dumb. But strangely, since Elon Musk bought it, and I feel very passionately about free speech, and I think that free speech has been eroded in this country, and I think that the media is just full of propaganda, and more so than ever before. And I'm very much against cancel culture and censorship. I'm very much against those things. So I got back onto Twitter for that reason. So you can find me on Twitter. Just look up Mark Hadfield. I don't have many followers, so I'd love to get a couple more followers. And it's interesting. I think the more I've used Twitter, the more I've liked it recently. I find that, first of all, you get the news faster and you get opinion from people that you're not going to see elsewhere. And many of those people are extremely skilled, talented. They have PhDs, they have years and years of experience in certain fields, and yet they've been censored and pushed out of the mainstream narrative because they have a counter view to what the ruling elites want us to be thinking about. So, but you find them on Twitter. So it's I know Elon Musk gets a lot of criticism for many different things, but I believe he's done a good thing for the world by keeping Twitter a place of free speech. So you can find me there. Or if you want to find about Persimmon, just go to our website, Persimmon.life. We're growing across the country. We're going to be in Texas this quarter. We're going to be in multiple different states by the end of the year. So hopefully you'll see it anyway, even if you don't look for it. That would be ideal.
Yeah, and I'm not making a joke here. I know you're a few years older than me. I'm 47 now, but you look great. Are you a customer of your own services?
That's funny. No, I'm not. I don't
Oh
use
man,
Botox or anything like that. Yeah, I do CrossFit and use facial moisturizer. That's my tips for staying young.
okay, awesome, awesome. Well, I was going to say you are like the best representative for something like that because you are looking extremely young. And I just appreciated the conversation we had today, Mark. There were so many other areas I wanted to dig into, but we only have an hour, so we'll just save that for our private conversations. But I wanted to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy day to share some of your stories, some of your knowledge with the people watching. And I try to keep this as diverse as possible. And, I'm very anti-censorship as well. I believe good idea, bad idea, people should be able to express them. And if we were as evolved as we think we are, then people should be able to make up their own decision on what they resonate with and what they don't resonate with. So I appreciate you being an advocate for free speech, and I appreciate you coming on here and being so honest with everything that has been going on.
Thanks, Seibo. And one comment, I'd just like to tell you that I think that you're really, really good at explaining the metaphysical aspects of your own discovery in terms that people can understand. So keep that up. I think it's a talent of yours.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me
My
on
goal,
today. Appreciate it. Yeah.
my, my goal is to make atheists turn into agnostics.
Keep working on it.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right. Ciao.